What's happening, folks? Back with another reaction, back with some more acid techno, and we're going back to a tune from Chris and Sterling. It's a tune that sort of celebrates acid techno, and indeed, if you follow acid techno, you know it's one of the more self-referential genres, I think in a very cool way. Once I became addicted to the sound of the silver box, I basically enjoyed all sort of references to acid music, and sort of, especially when they're very much like, sort of about the way that acid techno is sort of unconcerned with what mainstream music is doing, even like mainstream electronic music, even like mainstream techno. And indeed, that's what this track is about, which is to say, so I like acid references in acid techno overall, but I particularly like those that are sort of like, hey, we're not going to, compromise, like, this is an underground DIY punk rock sort of genre, and that's what we do. And this track, it's called I'm Bored, parentheses, Love Acid. There's a version on the other side, I'm Bored, parentheses, Love Techno. It's cool too, but, when I bought this record, I definitely bought it for the Love Acid side. Though I guess it's fair to say, it's not as, like, acid-drenched as you might think. It's not, like, super saturated. The acid waits a little bit to come in, and when it does, it's kind of, like, tight and focused and not really, like, wet and warbly. So I do remember being a bit surprised. I still think it's a great tune. It's just if you're going to name a tune I'm Bored, Love Acid, you'd think it'd be a bit more like heavily saturated. But again, it's not a criticism. I really do enjoy the track. It was just like a bit surprising when I first heard it. But anyway, the point of this track is the vocal, which I believe it's just Chris and Sterling, and they say, we're bored of minimal, we're bored of electro, but we still love acid. And indeed, post-2000, electronic music began to get a lot more mainstream credibility and respect, and there are certain types of techno that became like very popular again in like clubs and sort of like mainstream music industries way more than it ever was in the 90s. But a lot of it, as happens in a lot of music, like punk rock eventually went mainstream, but when it did so, it was the most kind of like safe, watered down, like not muckraking, not boat rocking punk rock that became, it's like, pop punk and sort of like emo punk is what became sort of like grafted onto the mainstream music industry as punk rock. And I think that sort of happened to techno. I think a lot of the techno that became like very popular, where you'd actually hear it on the radio or in cafes and like whatever, it's slower, it's more minimal, it's stripped down, it's sort of like, again, pop techno, and electro, which, I respect the sort of history of electro, and it's like sort of like in the nether space between hip hop and electronic music. But again, it's not the sort of like underground, hard, muckraking acid techno that we've known and loved since the 90s. So again, this is 2008, about a decade or so after the end of the glory days. And it's Chris and Sterling saying, we're bored of all this minimal techno. We're bored of all this electro we're hearing everywhere, but we still love acid. And so do I. And now this is 14 years ago, and I'm still here to say that I'm bored of mainstream pop techno, but I do indeed love acid. So shout out to Chris and Sterling. This is I'm Bored, Love Acid, 2008, Stay Up Forever. Do we have a cat number here? I assume we do. 92. Stay Up Forever 92, and as Stay Up Forever always reminds us, do not exceed the dose. Ooh, little fluff ball. There was a remix vinyl of this years later. I want to say it was like 2014, 2015. I have that somewhere. There's a Wipeouts remix, which the Wipeouts is Chris Sterling with Aaron. I'll come back for that one soon. I guess it doesn't wait all that long. I was thinking like of the main riff, but again, it's not like hypnotic acid. It's not like a wall of acid. It's just tight, focused. The percussion is very like, almost like galloping. It's not waiting around. That little quick mini breakdown, I was doing that like phasing in and out of reality effect. Cymbals bouncing over the top. At the risk of being crucified by people, you could throw a house in there too and I wouldn't be too upset. I do like acid house people, and one or two other house tracks, but generally speaking, house, it's like minimal techno. It bores me.
But still love.
It's a brilliant touch to this build-up, to like extend and repeat that acid. And it's a very like attention-grabbing build-up, but in the moment, the build and release is like just sort of matter of fact. It's not, doesn't have a huge roll, like cymbal crash, sample, it just, the cymbal sounded nice. Metal and moving parts. But you would agree, surely, like, it's not burning your brain down with acid. It's a very, like, tight and, like, concentrated application. A sort of, like, dissonant, backward flowing, like, bass. Like that. Still love acid, and then it like extends and kills the little tight riff. Though I would say, I have talked about outros like this before. In a cluster set, you could get away with this, but if you're doing a big like bright acid techno mix, too long of just something like this, the energy is going to drop, and then you're going to have to pull it up again, and it'll feel a bit odd, whereas if you kind of like blend with another track, so that there's always like something going on more than just the kick. I mean, there is that, but still, I would mix out before we get here, is what I'm saying. But yeah, all that DJ assessment aside, it's a top tune. It's a classic. It's sort of an anti-anthem, right? Like, it's anthemic, and yet the very nature of the sample and the sort of like, declaration is sort of inherently like anti-establishment. Therefore, it's sort of again an anti-anthem. So yeah, it's a top tune. I enjoyed a great deal. Not my favorite by them, because other tunes by Chris and Sterling are among my favorite, like Halloween and Punk Attitude, and the techno, the reggae, and the heavy ska. So I like a lot of their tunes a great deal. So I wouldn't even put this maybe in my top 3 or 5, but it's classic, and it's also relevant to me in the sense that like I went through a bit of a record buying hiatus. I was still occasionally getting records, still occasionally doing acid sets. But between like '05 and '07, maybe even early '08, I wasn't buying nearly as many records and I wasn't mixing nearly as much. This record was one of the ones that got me to sort of, reconnect with Stay Up Forever specifically. And indeed, I started ordering from their website right around the time this came out. It was very early days on their website, and that's how I met Aaron. And eventually I would go back and forth with him about releases, and oh, are you gonna get this, or I just ask him about upcoming tracks and so on. And eventually I sent him an email, but Chris was the one who answered it, and that's how I met Chris. And the rest, as they say, is history. So shout out to the Liberators, shout out to the Stay Up Forever websites, shout out to the Stay Up Forever label. I was talking to Tassos about this, like. There's so many artists and like labels that like they had a great run, and there's this golden period of their work, and then in some cases maybe they've come back in more recent times and they're making tunes, but it's a little bit different than they used to do. Whatever. Stay Up Forever and artists like Chris and Geezer and DDR and so on, Henry, they've been making acid techno and sort of that London acid sound for going on 26, 27 years now, a long time. And they're still here, they're still doing it, still putting tracks on vinyl, bringing new artists into it, sort of doing collaborations. Bottom line, big shout out to the Stay Up Forever people, the Liberators especially, but again, like Geezer and Henry and Dave DDR and a lot of the sort of old school folks, along with one of my favorite people, Bad Boy Pete. But yeah, bottom line, shout out to all the people who've like continued to champion the acid techno sound and keep it on vinyl for as long as they've had. Or as long as they have, while a number, again, of other awesome artists and labels and, different styles eventually went digital, stopped producing altogether, moved on to other things. So, bottom line, shout out to all them. Do let me know what you think of this tune. I'll see you next time.